What happens when a simple traffic stop spirals out of control? Lucas Reynolds, a lawyer, gets pulled over by Officer Hayes, but things aren't as they seem. What starts as a minor infraction quickly turns into something much bigger. The sun was beginning to set over Sacramento, casting long shadows along the street. Lucas Reynolds, a lawyer, was driving home after a long day at the office. The hum of his sedan was soothing as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to unwind after the hectic hours at work. The radio played quietly in the background, a soft contrast to the noise of the city. As he neared the intersection, the light turned yellow. Lucas slowed down and came to a stop just as it switched to red. Before he could even register the change, the sudden flash of blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror, followed by the wail of a police siren. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as the police cruiser parked behind him. Officer Daniel Hayes, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a sharp demeanor, stepped out. He had the air of someone who was used to commanding respect. "License and registration," Hayes barked, his voice clipped and authoritative. Lucas didn't hesitate. He reached into his glove compartment, pulled out his registration, and handed over his driver's license. His movements were smooth and deliberate. There was something in Hayes' eyes, though, that made Lucas feel like he was under a microscope. The officer didn't seem interested in the simple traffic violation anymore. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Hayes asked, leaning in slightly. "I'm not entirely sure," Lucas replied calmly. "I thought I came to a full stop at the light." Hayes' eyes narrowed. "You didn't. I watched you roll through it." Lucas frowned slightly but nodded in understanding. "Got it. My mistake." Instead of handing back his documents, Hayes lingered, his gaze lingering over Lucas, as if searching for something more. The air between them shifted, becoming heavier. Lucas could feel the officer's suspicion growing. "You're not from around here, are you?" Hayes asked, his tone changing slightly. Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Hayes wasn't listening to that. His questions continued, sharp and pointed. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Lucas replied, trying to maintain his calm, though he sensed the officer's suspicion wasn't rooted in the traffic violation. The officer took a step back, folding the documents slowly, almost theatrically, before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Step out of the car," Hayes said suddenly, his voice firm. Lucas's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but his face remained neutral. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" The officer's gaze hardened, and without a word he repeated, "Step out of the car." Lucas exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. He opened the door and stepped out, his posture tall and composed. Hayes' eyes ran over him, sizing him up. Lucas could feel the officer's attempt to assert dominance in the way he commanded, in the way he patted Lucas down. The search wasn't routine, it was invasive, meant to provoke. "Clean," Hayes muttered after finishing the search, his voice tinged with frustration. Lucas didn't react, his voice calm as he spoke. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." Hayes' frustration was palpable. He stepped closer, his voice lower. "You seem to know an awful lot about how these things work. Care to explain why?" Lucas met the officer's eyes, unfazed. "I've had a few interactions with law enforcement over the years," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot." Hayes didn't reply immediately, but Lucas could see the shift in his posture. The officer's frustration was creeping up, and his control was slipping. Lucas had already caught on. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. Hayes wasn't just dealing with a driver. He was facing a challenge to his authority. The air between them was thick with tension. "Think you can talk your way out of this, huh?" Hayes muttered under his breath, clearly trying to provoke a response. Lucas didn't bite. He didn't need to. Instead, he kept his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything, officer. I'm just asking for clarity." Hayes narrowed his eyes. He was still trying to unnerve Lucas, but the lawyer's calm was starting to rattle him. "Yeah, well, it's not just the stop, is it?" Hayes continued, his words dripping with something darker. "It's the whole vibe you've got going, like you're expecting this." Lucas tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Hayes's. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're too calm," Hayes shot back, stepping forward, invading Lucas's personal space. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next. You sure you don't have something to hide?" Lucas held his ground. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "Nothing to hide, officer. Just a firm belief in transparency, that's all." For a moment, Hayes stood still, as if the idea of transparency had struck a nerve. He was used to running the show, to people responding to him with fear or nervousness. But Lucas wasn't afraid. He wasn't even rattled. And Hayes didn't know what to do with that. "What, you a lawyer or something?" Hayes asked, his tone now tinged with suspicion, as if that would explain Lucas's unusual poise. "Or something," Lucas replied, his lips curling into a slight smile that only deepened the officer's irritation. Hayes glared at him for a moment before pacing back and forth in front of the car. He was searching for something, anything to regain control of the situation. "You think you're smarter than me?" Hayes growled, finally stopping in front of Lucas. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Lucas met his gaze unflinchingly. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness," he said, his voice unwavering. At that, Hayes's patience broke. "Fairness?" he spat, taking another step closer, his breath now heavier. "This is about respect, not fairness. People like you—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, but it was too late. Lucas had already picked up on the subtle shift in his tone. "People like me?" Lucas repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Hayes hesitated, his hand instinctively resting on his belt, as if to remind himself of the power he wielded. But he could feel it now, the subtle loss of control. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. Lucas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang between them, thick and loaded with unsaid things. The officer was floundering, and Lucas was waiting for him to realize it. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his tone even but piercing. "This stopped being about a traffic violation the moment you started assuming things about me based on nothing but my appearance." The words landed with force, and for the first time, Hayes looked unsure. His jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Lucas had taken the lead in this conversation, and Hayes was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a power struggle. It was about the difference between right and wrong. "I'm going to ask you to turn around and put your hands on the car," Hayes said, his voice hardening again, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I'm searching you for weapons." Lucas's eyebrow arched and his voice was laced with disbelief. "Weapons? You think I'm carrying a weapon?" "I'm not going to ask you again," Hayes snapped, frustration clearly creeping into his voice. Lucas didn't flinch. Without a word, he turned and placed his hands on the hood of his car. He could feel Hayes's presence behind him, the crunch of the officer's boots against the asphalt. The search was rough, too rough. Hayes's hands slid down his suit jacket, lingering in places that were unnecessary, as if the officer was trying to force a reaction from him. Lucas didn't flinch, didn't move. He didn't give Hayes the satisfaction. "Clean," Hayes muttered after what seemed like an eternity, stepping back as if the search had somehow drained him. Lucas didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned around slowly, meeting Hayes's eyes. There was no triumph in his expression, only quiet authority. "Of course I am," he said calmly. "Now, officer, if you're done with the theatrics—" But Hayes wasn't done. He wasn't ready to give up yet. The silence between them stretched out, heavy in charge. Lucas could feel the shift in the air as Hayes tried to regain some semblance of control. The officer's frustration was palpable, but he was still clinging to his authority, hoping to intimidate Lucas into backing down. But Lucas wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Hayes was beginning to realize that this wasn't just another routine stop. The way Lucas carried himself, the way he remained calm and composed, was throwing him off. For the first time, Hayes wasn't sure of himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing this exchange, and that feeling was unsettling. "You seem pretty confident," Hayes muttered, his voice edged with suspicion. "Like you think you know how this is going to play out." Lucas didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression still neutral. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." The words hit Hayes like a slap to the face. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even an apology for the inconvenience. But there was none of that. Lucas wasn't backing down. Instead, he was standing his ground with a calmness that Hayes couldn't quite figure out. It rattled him more than he cared to admit. "Respect?" Hayes repeated, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "You think I owe you respect?" "I think respect is a two-way street, officer," Lucas replied, his voice steady but cutting. "And right now, you're on the wrong side of it." The officer bristled, his jaw tightening. He stepped forward, close enough that Lucas could feel his presence looming over him. "You're going to regret talking to me like that," Hayes growled, his hand hovering near his belt as if ready to escalate things even further. But Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He stood tall, his eyes locked on Hayes's. "I'm not afraid of you, officer. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to make sure we both do our jobs the right way." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Hayes was seething, but something in Lucas's demeanor made it clear that this wasn't going to be the confrontation he had hoped for. It wasn't going to go the way he thought it would. Hayes took a step back, his expression faltering for a moment as he processed what had just happened. He was used to being the one in control, used to the power that came with the badge. But Lucas had turned the tables on him, and it was disorienting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a standoff of sorts. Lucas calm, Hayes struggling to regain his footing. But then, just when it seemed like the officer was about to make another move, Lucas broke the silence. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You're going to take a step back, hand me back my documents, and then we're going to part ways. No more games." Hayes's eyes narrowed and his fingers twitched near his holster. It was clear he wasn't ready to back down just yet. He was still trying to figure out how to regain the upper hand. "Do you really think you can talk your way out of this?" Hayes spat, his voice thick with frustration. Lucas didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward slightly, closing the gap between them. "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything, officer, but I am trying to make sure you understand something important." "What's that?" Hayes growled, his eyes flashing with anger. "That you've already crossed a line," Lucas said, his tone cool and measured, "and I don't think you even realize it." For the first time, Hayes looked uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was something in Lucas's gaze that was making him question everything he thought he knew about this situation. It was clear now. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It wasn't even about the power struggle anymore. Lucas had put the officer in a position where he was forced to confront his own actions. As Hayes hesitated, Lucas's voice cut through the tension, steady and unyielding. "You don't know who I am, do you, officer?" Hayes froze, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" Lucas reached into his pocket, pulling out a leather wallet. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it, revealing a shiny badge. The silver gleamed in the fading sunlight as he held it up for Hayes to see. "Lucas Reynolds," he said calmly, "head of internal affairs for the Sacramento Police Department." The realization hit Hayes like a ton of bricks. His face drained of color as he stared at the badge, then back at Lucas. The air between them shifted again. This time, it was fear, not authority, that Hayes felt. "Internal affairs?" Hayes repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Lucas nodded, his expression still calm. "That's right. My job is to oversee officer conduct, to make sure that people wearing that badge uphold the integrity they swore to protect. And right now, you're not doing that." Hayes took a step back, his hand instinctively dropping away from his belt. His earlier bravado was gone. He was standing in front of someone who held not just authority, but a power that could reshape his future. The world around them seemed to freeze for a moment as Hayes took a small step back. His fingers twitched nervously, a sign that the confident officer Lucas had first encountered was now unraveling before his eyes. For the first time, Hayes was looking at the badge in Lucas's hand, like it was a symbol of his impending downfall. The weight of it felt too heavy to bear. Your internal affairs?" Hayes repeated, as if the words didn't fully register. Lucas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Hayes carefully, gauging his reaction. The officer was clearly rattled now, his earlier defiance slipping through his fingers. The arrogance, the posture of power, everything that had defined Hayes was now crumbling away, leaving behind an uncertain man who had just realized the gravity of his mistake. Lucas exhaled slowly, then took a small step forward. He didn't need to say much more. His presence alone spoke volumes. Hayes had already crossed a line, and now the question was whether he had the integrity to own up to it. Lucas had his doubts. "You know what the most troubling part of this entire interaction is?" Lucas asked, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the thick silence between them. Hayes stood frozen, his eyes wide as he waited for Lucas to continue, his mind still racing to process the revelation that internal affairs was standing in front of him. The realization was sinking in, and the officer knew his world was about to come crashing down. But he couldn't speak. He couldn't bring himself to say anything. He just stood there looking at the badge, then back at Lucas, as if searching for some way to undo the mess he'd made. Lucas's eyes never wavered. "It's not the profiling," he continued, his voice unwavering. "Though that's bad enough, it's not the escalation of force either. The most troubling part is that you've done all of this without even realizing who you're talking to." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Hayes's face twitched, his eyes flicking away for a moment as if trying to avoid the weight of Lucas's gaze. But Lucas wasn't done. "You assumed I didn't know my rights," Lucas said, his voice dropping slightly. "That I didn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold." Hayes opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he didn't know how to respond. It was as if Lucas had peeled back the layers of everything Hayes thought he knew, revealing the raw truth beneath. "I didn't fit your idea of someone who deserves respect, did I?" Lucas asked softly, his voice charged with meaning. The question hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He bristled, his hands trembling slightly. For a split second, he considered pushing back, but something inside him knew it was too late. He couldn't deny the truth in Lucas's words. He had assumed, and in doing so, he had made a grave mistake. I don't know what you mean," Hayes stammered, his voice cracking. Lucas's gaze hardened, his expression unshifting. "You know exactly what I mean, officer. This isn't about the traffic stop anymore. It's about how you see the people you're supposed to serve. It's about the implicit bias that shapes your actions." The officer's mouth opened, but again, no words came out. It wasn't because he didn't have a defense. It was because Lucas's words were cutting through the armor Hayes had spent years building. The tough exterior was cracking, revealing the vulnerability beneath. Hayes could feel the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him, suffocating him in front of someone who had the authority to expose everything. But Lucas wasn't finished. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but the words were sharp enough to pierce the stillness between them. "And that's the problem, officer," Lucas continued. "People like me don't get the benefit of your respect, do they? We don't fit your mold of who deserves fair treatment." Hayes flinched at the words, his face flushed with shame, but he couldn't deny the truth of what Lucas was saying. He had been operating on assumptions, on stereotypes, and now those assumptions were staring him down. "I didn't mean to," Hayes started, but Lucas cut him off, raising a hand. "No, you didn't mean to," Lucas said, his voice cold. "But that's the problem. You didn't even realize what you were doing. You let your biases dictate your actions, and now you're facing the consequences." For a moment, Hayes said nothing. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his gaze shifted downward. He was starting to understand. The realization was dawning on him, and the weight of it was too much to bear. He had made a mistake, a big one, and there was no way to undo it. Lucas's voice softened just a bit. "But here's the thing, officer. I'm not here to make you pay for that mistake. I'm here to make sure you understand it, and that you learn from it." Hayes looked up, his eyes searching Lucas's face for some hint of mercy. But Lucas's expression remained stoic, the calm authority of someone who knew what needed to be done. Hayes swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "You've been warned," Lucas said, his tone firm. "But this isn't over. I'll be reporting this. And there will be a review, not just of your actions, but of the culture that allowed this to happen." Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but Lucas raised a finger, silencing him. "You don't get to speak anymore," Lucas said, his voice low but final. "I'm done here." And with that, Lucas turned, walking toward his car. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Hayes was left standing there, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The arrogance, the authority, everything had crumbled in an instant, and now there was only one question left. How would he face the consequences of his actions? The next few days were a blur for Officer Hayes. The encounter with Lucas, the realization of what he had done, and the growing weight of the consequences all seemed to blend together into a single overwhelming storm. His badge felt heavier now, almost suffocating, as though it carried the weight of every bad decision he'd ever made. Hayes was called in for a departmental review. The people he had once regarded as allies now looked at him with a mix of pity and disappointment. He couldn't escape the truth of what had happened on that street corner, and the more he reflected on it, the more it became clear how deep the problem went. This wasn't just about him, it was about the system, a system that allowed biases to creep into the very actions of those who were supposed to protect and serve. Lucas didn't need to say much to his superiors. The case was already open. The report had been filed and internal investigations were underway. But it wasn't about just one officer. The culture within the department was rotten in places, and Lucas was determined to root it out. Weeks passed. Hayes' suspension dragged on, and Lucas's team continued their review. The department was under intense scrutiny now, not only for Hayes' actions, but for the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to persist unnoticed for so long. Public forums were held. Officers were interviewed. The conversation had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, the department was facing its own flaws head-on. But Lucas didn't rest. He didn't pat himself on the back for getting the internal review started or for forcing Hayes to confront his actions. No, Lucas knew that the real work had only just begun. The changes he was pushing for were monumental, not just for the police department, but for the community that had lost trust in it. A few months after the initial incident, Lucas found himself in a packed auditorium once again, this time standing before a room of officers, city officials, and local residents. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. There were still those who doubted that anything would truly change. But Lucas had spent every waking moment in the trenches, fighting for what was right, for what needed to happen, and for the kind of integrity that should define the badge. As he stepped up to the podium, he could see the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, others hopeful, but all paying attention. He cleared his throat and began speaking, not as a man standing on a platform, but as someone who had lived through the mistakes, the struggles, and the long road ahead. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, Lucas began, his voice steady and resolute. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we are rebuilding here. The room was silent for a moment, but then came the applause. It wasn't thunderous at first, but as the weight of his words settled in, the clapping grew louder. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a recognition of the hard work, the painful conversations, and the steps toward real change. Lucas didn't linger on the applause. It wasn't why he did this. He didn't want to be celebrated. He wanted results. He wanted to look back one day and know that the system was different, that it was better. As the crowd began to disperse, Lucas stood by the podium, his eyes scanning the room. He saw Officer Hayes in the back, standing silently, his face a mixture of guilt and contemplation. It had been a long road for Hayes, but Lucas could see something in him that hadn't been there before. Regret, yes, but also the faintest glimmer of awareness. The officer had learned something. He had been changed, whether he realized it or not. Lucas's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant. Meeting with the chief tomorrow to finalize the review results. Be ready. He took one last look around the room, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The work wasn't finished, and it wouldn't be for a long time. But today they had made a difference. As Lucas walked out of the auditorium and into the cool evening air, he didn't feel like celebrating. There was still more to do, more battles to fight, and more officers to hold accountable. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that change, though slow and difficult, was possible. And as he drove home that night, his mind didn't wander to the work still ahead or to the challenges yet to be faced. Instead, it lingered on one simple truth. This was just the beginning.